Hi, this is Miss Hadi from Olympian High School. We'll use the Traditions and Encounters textbook, starting with page 1079, chapter 38, to look at challenges to superpower hegemony following World War II during the Cold War. And we're going to look at the topic of the People's Republic of China. So, a couple of things I want you to know before we start. I want you to know where Taiwan is. So, here's China, here's Taiwan. It's directly north of the Philippines. I also want you to know what the word Politburo means.
Politburo.
So this is the policy-making committee of the Communist Party. It's usually referring to the one in the USSR, but today I'm going to use it to talk about China as well. I also want you to know what a metonym is. So metonym.
Metonym.
It's when we use like a small part of something to identify something larger. For example, saying Washington as a metonym of the federal government of the United States. Today I'll be using the metonyms like Beijing to represent the government of the Chinese party, the Chinese government in, well, it's a representation, it's symbol for the Chinese government, communist Chinese government. And I might use Moscow to represent a symbol of the Soviet Union. So Beijing for China and Moscow for the USSR, for the Soviet Union. And there's a couple of other words you should know, like what a bastion means and what Belai means, but make sure you learn about that on your own if there are words that are really tricky for you. So taking the time to do these things before you begin or as you read, looking at words you don't know should help you, just so it can, be absorbed more fully in your brain. So the first thing I'm going to say is just overall, to start, the Soviet Union and China, when it becomes communist in 1949, are going to be very closely aligned. But over time, that relationship will weaken. That's the essence of what I'm about to teach you. So we all know that China was in the middle of a civil war before World War II. The communists and the nationalists that were fighting in the Civil War temporarily unified during World War II to fight the Japanese. And then at the end of World War II, when the Japanese return home, the communists and the nationalists start fighting for power again. And towards the end of the war, the communists were already sort of poised to take over, but it becomes really clear that after the war, by 1948, 1949, that the communists are winning, the nationalists are losing. So the nationalists are going to retreat to that island of Taiwan that I showed you earlier. So Jiang Jieshi, also known as Chiang Kai-shek, are going to retreat here, taking most of China's gold. And they're going to say that they're ruling. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, is going to establish a new country called the People's Republic of China in October of 1949, which is a communist country, and that's going to draw him closer to the Soviet Union. Mao Zedong is going to replicate, imitate, emulate many of the aspects of Soviet socialism. So, for example, we're going to see them creating a constitution in 1954. You'll see that there is a Politburo, as I mentioned earlier, but so most of the power is basically with Mao Zedong. And we see lots of attempts to mobilize revolutionary zeal and to persecute people that had been associated with the former nationalists, and many of them died in labor camps. So you want to think of labor camps as being similar to, some people would say they are pretty much like concentration camps, but not to the same degree as, say, during the Holocaust with the Nazis' attacks on Jews and others. You'll also see economic transformation. We'll focus on that, an attempt for rapid industrialization over, for example, producing consumer goods initially, and then the collectivization of agriculture. So if that term mystifies you, it basically just means where you're taking private lands, private farms that belong to small families, taking them and putting them together in this large collective and having them be owned by the state, or therefore the people. And then basically trying to produce goods quickly to industrialize China, and then collectivizing agriculture. So you're taking lands from the rich and you're redistributing them. You're also collectivizing land. So all of these changes are economic, but there are also social changes as well. So some things that are positive, like providing healthcare, primary education, and some things that it depends on your point of view if they're positive or negative. For example, changing Chinese traditions regarding women. So some people might see that as a negative, some people might see that as a positive, depending on where you stand. So supporting equal rights for women, giving women the right to divorce their husbands, legalizing abortion, abolishing foot binding, all of these things were changes that were a result, consequence, effect of Chinese communism. At first, we see, as again, metonyms, Moscow representing the Soviet Union and Beijing representing Chinese Communist government, being very close, partly because they were both afraid that the United States was trying to create basically trying to eliminate communist bastions, or basically places from which communism could defend itself throughout Asia. Remember, at that time, the United States was supporting containment. They also were really upset with the way that the United States was helping the rehabilitation of the Japanese, especially after things like the rape of Nanjing. And then what we'll start to see is basically this Chinese communist partnership, where the communists in China being supported by the communists in the Soviet Union, through the Soviet Union sending technical advisors and also purchasing goods from China, becoming China's biggest trading partner. In the United Nations, the Soviet Union supported transferring China's seat from the Taiwanese government to the Chinese communist government. Then, however, we'll see some problems. One being the Soviet Union's tendency to lecture China on how to practice socialism. And other cracks in the alliance have to do with the fact that the Soviet Union, when providing aid to China, often had many strings attached, or required the payments to be paid back in full quickly when China was tight on capital. You see that during the Korean War. You also see friction or conflict over the tension between China and India in an area called Tibet. So Tibet is in Western China, and after China became communist, they tried to reassert control over Tibet. They started fighting with people who wanted independence in Tibet, and the Chinese were convinced that this was fomented by India, and so you start to see the Chinese fighting India, and the Soviet Union basically saying that it was neutral in that conflict, but this was belied by the fact that they gave India a loan, in a loan that basically they had never given something in that same way to China, a loan to India that exceeded any similar loan ever given to China. So you'll see other things in here that cause rifts, growing separation, difference, problems. We see this really becoming public when the Chinese government starts to basically belittle this attempt at pursuing peaceful coexistence with the United States and Western Europe. Nikita Khrushchev wanted this peaceful coexistence because he was trying to prevent a nuclear war from destroying all of the world. But the Chinese use this really mean, derogatory word to describe the Soviet Union as it pursued this policy of peaceful coexistence. They basically call them revisionists, which is a really mean word, a derogatory word that you could call someone in the communist vocabulary. Meanwhile, you start to see Nikita Khrushchev saying Mao Zedong and his, party is a bunch of left-wing adventurers that were going to get us all killed in a civil war. You also see China and the Soviet Union vying for power in newly created nations, trying to get them to align with them more quickly. So you're starting to see them go along separate paths to be different powers and not be as aligned. And the effect of this is it's going to give many newly independent countries the opportunity to play the Chinese communists against the Soviet communists, and of course against the United States capitalists, to pursue more independent policies.